Welcome back, and I'm really pleased to welcome to the committee now Dr Brian Blastow, Scottish Biometrics Commissioner, and Ross MacDonald, Director of the Scottish Biometric Commissioner Office. Thank you for being with us today and for your written submission as well, and for your time. We move directly to questions, and similarly to as we've asked other witnesses in recent weeks, the first question is from me, and I would just be grateful if you could set out what do you consider to be the purpose of the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner, and how does this differ from the role of ministers, MSPs and other bodies for the public and common good of Scotland?
I mean, thanks for the question. I mean, I think if I was answering that question to a public audience, I would just simply say that the purpose of the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner is to exercise independent oversight of how 3 policing bodies in Scotland acquire, retain, use and destroy people's biometric data. And by that I mean primarily fingerprints, DNA and photographs and recordings that are either taken from people because they've been arrested or are taken from people because they've been victims of crime. So that would be the generic answer we give. But obviously, the function that we do comes from the Scottish Biometrics Commissioners Act of 2020, passed by the former Parliament. And the function is to support and promote the lawful, effective and ethical use of biometric data for policing and criminal justice purposes in Scotland. So the 3 important words in that statement are lawful, effective and ethical. So in discharging that kind of specialist oversight role, how our function differs from Parliament is, of course, you people are all elected by the public. I'm in essence elected by you guys because as an independent office holder of the Parliament, we are all appointed by a committee of MSPs. So yeah, it's a kind of specialist policing function that we do, and in doing that we work very closely with other bodies working in the criminal justice arena, is what I would say. About 99% of our work's proactive, because if you are charged with keeping the law, policy and practice under review, you can't do that from behind your desk, so you have to get out there and you have to ask probing questions. Does that answer your...
Yes, I appreciate it. It was quite a broad question, yeah. But I think your remarks are helpful, and of course, as you stated in your written submission, there's a specialist independent oversight function that you have, and also, interestingly, that you're the newest commissioner.
Yes, I'm the oldest and also the newest at the same time.
So, you know, in that context, it'd be interesting, and your written submission was really helpful because you didn't just talk about your function and body, but yes, you actually spoke to the wider challenge that we've been yes, given by the Parliament and more broadly. So, do you want to talk a bit more about what you perceive the current role of the SPCB supported bodies to be in enhancing public trust and confidence in public life in Scotland, both in terms of your responsibilities, but anything more widely that you want to emphasise?
Yeah, I mean, happy to do all of that. I mean, I think I said in my written submission and in previous evidence to the Finance Committee that, you know, this landscape has evolved organically since about 2002. And when I was appointed in 2021, I was probably the first commissioner since about 2008, 2009, something like that. And of course, were you to design that system today from scratch, you would design it very differently. So I suppose my starting point in all of this is I don't actually think that the existing landscape is not fit for purpose. I think that's unhelpful language to use. I would prefer to say that there is room for significant improvement in the landscape. And by that I mean I think there are opportunities for better scrutiny, more accountability, more sharing of services, more collaborations. And I actually, my personal view is that the key to unlocking some of that is to have a kind of hub and spoke model, as I would call it, where you have a kind of centralised engine room, if that's not the wrong word, which provides the kind of mission critical corporate functions such as finance, HR, financial processing, etc. And that the spoke element is where the independent office holders then discharge their very different mandates that they have, because they are very different, and whilst all of them arguably involve an element or component of public trust, the word trust doesn't feature in most of their legislation. So it's about, I think, an opportunity that presents itself at the moment to reframe that landscape in a better, more effective and efficient way, and in a way that provides probably better value and more transparent value to the public. If that answers your question.
That does, and it's also helpful for what colleagues will come in with in due course. First of all, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Just to follow on that first point from the convener, one thing the committee is interested in is looking at synergies between the work of current commissioners. We heard from the Information Commissioner just before you came in. Are there, in your view, any synergies or overlaps between the work you do, for example, and that of the Information Commissioner?
So there are no legislative overlaps in terms of our primary mandate. But of course, what we all share in common is that we're all appointed by the Parliament and that we are all funded by the Parliament Corporation. So that necessitates, if not demands, sharing of services, because otherwise you end up with a series of 7 cottage industries if you don't do that. So one of the things when I was appointed was, and perhaps because I was appointed mid-pandemic at a time when it was not legally permitted to physically meet with anybody, it was both desirable and necessary for me to enter into a shared services arrangement at the outset, because I didn't want to rush off and recruit staff at all. I wanted to think about how this function should be properly structured to provide best value for the public purse. So, and I think the model that we have, I mean, I have 3 full-time staff, only 3 full-time staff. Ross has joined me for a period of 2 years on temporary secondment from Police Scotland. That is partly about bringing some ready expertise into the organisation to help us over a kind of demanding period. But it's also a developmental position, because nowadays in the world of policing, there are very limited opportunities to gain exposure to everything that goes with governance in a small public authority. So I think we provide proof of concept that the shared services model can work. I mean, we are, I'll say it again, very small, but we have successfully operated now for nearly 4 years. Our audit, annual reports and accounts have been cleared by Audit Scotland. So the proof of concept has withstood external audit and scrutiny. We now have at Bridgeside House, where we're based, the Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Children's Commissioner now buying in, if that's not the wrong phrase, to the shared services model. And so I think we need more of that. We need more shared services. We need more collaborations. But the other point I just wanted to make, which I did in my evidence submission anyway, is we shouldn't confine that partnership working to only within those 7 bodies. So, for example, I operate in the criminal justice space. I meet regularly with Chief Inspector of Constabulary, Chief Inspector of Prisons, Chief Inspector of Prosecutions, Port Commissioner, Chief Inspector of Fire and Rescue. We have almost like a informal peer support network, if that's not the wrong way to describe it. So there are also opportunities for further shared services and or collaboration in that space. I'll give you one example. We because we only have a small budget, we don't have our own media function, for example. So we use, through His Majesty's, as it is nowadays, Chief Inspector of Constabulary, we use their media person to do our media. And we'll be laying a report in Parliament next Wednesday, where we have done a really detailed review of DNA. Can't say too much about that until it's laid in Parliament, but we've done it in partnership with the Scottish Police Authority and the Leverhulme Institute of Forensic Science. We are also working at the moment with His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary on another review that will be laid in Parliament in about 3 or 4 weeks' time on how the police use retrospective image search technologies within a couple, two UK databases, the Child Abuse Image Database, and something called PND, Police National Intelligence Database, which is a UK intelligence system. So the point of sharing these examples with you is that we actually work very proactively in partnership with not only other bodies within the SPCB landscape, primarily the SPSO, who we have the shared services agreement with, but also with other partners in the criminal justice space. So that's a clumsy way of saying that we are advocates of and provide visible evidence of opportunities for partnership working, more collaborations, more shared services.
Thank you. That's a very helpful overview. And I'd just like to understand a little bit more about how the shared service model works in practice in terms of lines of accountability, who pays for what. So you referenced, as an example, the media output that is provided elsewhere. So how does that work in terms of your budget? Do you financially contribute to that? In practice, how does that work?
Yeah, so if we need to use a media professional because, for example, we're laying a report in Parliament, we will engage the services of that media professional on an hourly daily rate. Okay. So, you know, if, for example, when we lay the DNA report in Parliament next week, that might cost me 2 days of a media professional's time.
Okay. And would that same principle then apply to other functions such as finance and HR? No.
So originally, back in 2021, when I entered into a shared services agreement with Rosemary, the deal that was brokered through the Parliament Corporation was that I would surrender at that time, I think it was about £22,000 from my core budget in exchange for surrendering that amount. I would be given an office at Bridgeside House. I would be provided with my HR services to allow me to then recruit 4 staff, although I chose only to recruit 3. To do all my financial processing, facilities management, mail handling. Probably the best deal I ever made in my life, to be honest. But now I don't have to pay anything into it. So, in essence, my budget would be graduated down the way, and the SPSO's budget graduated up to pay for the equivalent of half an extra member of staff.
Okay. And effectively, your budget therefore is top sliced.
Yes, exactly.
And money goes into the central pot.
Exactly.
That's very interesting. Okay, let me ask you a slightly different question, because we're looking at the criteria for creating new supported bodies, which is something that you reference in your written submission. And in that, you stress the importance of objectivity, and that there should always be a presumption against creating new commissioners. So based on your experience, what criteria should be prioritised? when considering creation of new SPCB supported bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the existing criteria that the Parliament has are the correct criteria. However, despite that, we sometimes end up in a position where, for example, you will have the Finance Committee saying that had the Parliament applied these criteria correctly, then we would not have moved forward with a patient safety commissioner. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the criteria. I think the criteria are the correct ones. But I suppose my broader point is that by its very nature, Parliament operates in a political environment, and sometimes it can be politically expedient to do something or not do something. And I suppose that's the challenge for Parliament. But, you know, we really should not be creating additional public authorities in Scotland unless there's an absolute need to do so. And quite often, there is another way of achieving the same result, I think. You know, so if you think about the Patient Safety Commissioner, for example, then the issues that gave rise to the perceived need for a Patient Safety Commissioner probably can be addressed in other ways. Those are matters for the Parliament. But I suppose my substantive answer to your question is that I do think the Parliament has the correct criteria and it needs to apply them.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we explored some of these issues with the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman when she was here in front of committee 2 weeks ago, particularly around the Patient Safety Commissioner issue. Okay, one more question, if I can, just again going back to your written submission. And you say you would encourage the Parliament to put budgetary control measures in place to ensure that the landscape does not grow exponentially over this parliamentary session and beyond. So can you expand on what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the current landscape, where you have 7 different bodies supported by the Parliament Corporation, I bet if you went back in time and looked at how many staff each of these organisations had when they were established, it will bear no resemblance to what they have now. And it's I suppose the point I'm clumsily trying to make is, if you are charged with running one of these organisations and you're under a bit of pressure or a bit of demand, it's very easy to go to the Parliament Corporation cap in hand and ask for more resources, and they may or may not give you them. But whenever you invest in more staff, then that's a long-term financial obligation. And isn't it funny that nobody ever disinvests in anything? You know, so you get this kind of unregulated growth.
But Dr. Plasto, you've done very well. You're employing fewer staff than you were intending. So you're an exemplar of what can be done.
Well, maybe I'm a control freak. I don't know, but no. I mean, on a serious point, I've worked in public services all my life, and I've always had a keen eye to the public purse. So if there's a better and more effective, more efficient way of doing it, then that's my job to ensure that happens. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now turn to Lawrence Slater.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener. I mean, we've talked a lot about this sort of complicated landscape. Your role and the role of your office is is the newest, but also I think probably the most specific and narrowest. And would it be right to say that this is largely as a result of changes to technology and I guess evidence gathering methods? So I guess part of my question is, as we look ahead to the future of the landscape, we can imagine that new technologies, AI, goodness knows what's ahead of us, might require other bits of data protection, good practice by police, and so on and so on. If we're imagining a robust shape for this landscape such that in the future other things are required, is that something that you imagine that you could be incorporated with your office? Would there be other commissioners? Like how do we make your function or the role you play in that wider landscape robust to future technological advance?
Yeah. So I'll give you a two-part answer to that question. So the first thing is to rewind a bit and say that in every one of my annual reports to the Parliament, I've highlighted opportunities for expansion of remit. And not once have I ever suggested that that would involve more resource. So one of the things that I have said to the Criminal Justice Committee and others is that biometric data is exchanged throughout the entire criminal justice ecosystem in Scotland. So it's exchanged between the police, the prisons, the courts, etc., etc. So it's a kind of artificial construct to restrict my functions to 3 policing bodies. Because when you then have good decisions by Scottish Government to invest in things like the digital evidence sharing capability, and you have biometric data then ingested into that system, then some of that system is beyond oversight. The other area that I often highlight is public space safety camera oversight. I've said before that I see that as a strategic gap in Scotland. We do not have a coherent public safety camera strategy. That could easily be put in place with a code of practice. Why that becomes important is I recently had a meeting with Liz Smith and Ross Greer broadly about questions of the extent of potential foreign state surveillance in Scotland. But all of that product that comes from public space, public safety cameras, only becomes within my statutory function once it's received by Police Scotland. So I don't have any kind of locus in the wider data-rich environment. So I suppose what I'm clumsily trying to say is there are opportunities to maximise the value that you get from your independent office holders, and those opportunities don't always involve additional cost. So, yeah, I probably went off on a tangent there and totally lost.
No, not at all, because one of the things we want to look at with this landscape is not just overlaps, but also gaps, where there is potential gaps. And it seems to me that we all have biometric passports now. Yeah. We can imagine a future where payments are made, systems are made by biometrics, where your library card has biometrics. Like, you can absolutely imagine that becoming a standard identification technique and so on. So when imagining this landscape, we need to make sure that gaps are covered and that it is robust, so that there isn't a sort of instinct to create a new commission every time a new thing is developed, that we create that. So no, thank you for your answer on that one. Partly just to help me to make sure I haven't made a mistake here, in sort of comparing your role to some of the other commissioners and parliamentary supported, I can't even say it, parties that we've been talking to on this one, many of those have a very public-facing role. Am I right in thinking your role is entirely or nearly entirely not public? So public don't come to you when they've got a problem. Your role is about supporting the police.
The public do come to us when they've got a problem. So we have... one of our functions is to maintain a statutory code of practice. So members will remember that on the 16th of November 2022, the Parliament passed our statutory code of practice, and basically it's a principles-based framework which Police Scotland, the Scottish Police Authority and the PIRC must comply with. And that's accompanied by information gathering powers. It's accompanied by powers to serve information notices and compliance notices on, for example, Police Scotland, and it's accompanied by a public complaints mechanism. In the early years after the code was approved by Parliament, we did not receive any complaints, but that was mainly because Police Scotland, when they were arresting people, were not telling them that, not telling them anything, to be honest. One of the recommendations we made from a report in 2023 was that, as happens everywhere else in the United Kingdom, if someone's arrested, you, the police, must tell the person why you're taking their data, what you're going to use it for, where you're going to store it, and who you're going to share it with. So as a result of that recommendation, and it took Police Scotland, this isn't a criticism, but it took them a year to produce an information leaflet. And what that means now is that in 90,000 custody episodes each year in Scotland, members of the public who are arrested and deprived of their liberty and who have their biometrics taken are given an information leaflet that explains all of that and also explains about the code of practice and about our function. And we have, in the last few weeks, received our first 2 complaints about the code of practice. So we do receive complaints from the public on a very small scale. Just to touch on something that he had asked David about earlier on was, we are absolutely proactive in putting information out. We use our, because of our small size, we use our public-facing website as an information repository. We publish almost everything, so we try to use that as a primary public engagement mechanism, but we also we do what we can. We engage in different forums. We speak at conferences. It's difficult when you're a tiny organisation to do a lot with limited resource and budget, but I think it works well.
And finally, for those aspects that are public facing, when someone has a complaint or wants to come to you for information, or they've had an issue with the police, something we've talked about with some of the other witnesses is a sort of one-stop shop. So if you're a citizen, citizen resident of Scotland, you've got a problem with a public service, maybe the police, and you don't know where to start because this is a complicated landscape, but you need help. Would a sort of one-stop shop, single portal be useful to people who access your services?
I think this goes back to maybe my first or second answer about this hub and spoke model. I mean, there already is, you've got to be good to find it, but you can go onto the Parliament website, for example, you can find the page that has the 7 independent office holders on it, and within that page is a link to each of our websites that explain what we do. But it's kind of clunky and it's not very easy, it's not very accessible, is probably what I would say. So I'm very attracted to, not to the proposition of creating a new body, because I think that's the last thing we should be doing, but I'm very attracted to the proposition of some re-engineering to create a kind of centralised shared service hub, even if that involves some of us surrendering resource to do that and having this kind of hub and spoke. That's just a personal view. I don't speak for any of the other office holders in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Now turn to Richard Leonard.
Thanks. I think, Dr. Plaster, you've answered some of my rudimentary questions, which are about the extent to which you're reactive and proactive, and you've said you're 90% proactive. One of the other related questions is, in this debate, people define certain commissions and commissioners as regulatory and others as advocacy commissioners. Where would you place yourself in that spectrum?
Yeah, I would say we're a specialist oversight body, is what I would say. I mean, our function in law is to support and promote. Those sound like advocacy words, but it's then the lawful, effective and ethical use of biometric data. And I think, as I said in an earlier answer, is you kind of need to know the right questions to ask to satisfy yourself that those 3 dimensions are being properly addressed. So, yeah, we kind of perform a specialist oversight function. We're an arm's length body of the Parliament, is what I would say. Members will remember that the former Justice Subcommittee on Policing under the previous Parliament had to invest a significant amount of time on looking at things like digital triage devices, Police Scotland's strategy/policy on facial recognition. And some members who've been around a lot longer will remember the Shirley McKee fingerprint scandal and how badly all that ended. So, yeah, I wouldn't want to pigeonhole us into any particular group, but I think specialist oversight's probably the best descriptor of of what we do.
Okay, that's fine. You also touched on, in response to an earlier question, about areas where you think your remit could usefully be extended. And I think, as Lorna Slater has described, this is an evolving set of challenges which you are going to come up against and try and proactively preempt. But are there other aspects of your powers that you think could be enhanced, that would give you better outcomes to the work that you do?
No, because in the Scottish Biometrics Commissioners Act, the Act says that the Commissioner may do anything necessary or expedient in the discharge of his functions. That's quite wide-ranging. The specific powers that we have in the Act are, in relation to the Code of Practice, are the power to gather information. We have used that power, and we've used that. We have served an information notice on Police Scotland previously in connection with their ingestion of biometric data to the digital evidence sharing capability. The reason for serving the information notice was to find out whether the sovereignty of the data was being properly protected and whether the security of the data was being properly protected. We've never yet had to serve a compliance notice on the code. We have conducted 2 rounds of formal compliance assessments on the Code of Practice with the 3 organisations. The winter just passed, we found them all compliant with the Code of Practice. The year before, we found them all compliant with the Code of Practice. But I should say that in relation to Police Scotland, the compliance this year is conditional on them discharging the recommendations that were made jointly with Scottish Government last autumn in a joint review of the laws of retention. And to explain that in layman's language, we think Police Scotland are keeping biometric data for too long, and they are not reviewing the retention as they're required to do by law.
Okay. A final question from me, and you're very blunt in your written submission, contrary to Mr Hamilton's position, where you say individual corporate HQs are an unaffordable luxury.
Yeah.
So that's a clear statement of your view, and you're very strong on sharing services. That comes through both in your evidence this morning and in the written submission we received. In your written evidence, you also alluded to the fact that you are dealing at times with, not directly perhaps, but dealing with the data around vulnerable adults, children and young people, and you also talk in your written submission about information rights. So the question I think we'd like to get an answer to is the extent to which you do collaborate, work with those other commissions. You know, if you're dealing with the treatment of the biometric data of young people and people below the age of 18 and so on, do you have conversations with the Children and Young People's Commissioner and understand or a human rights approach to some of these questions? What is the extent of your interaction?
No, it's a great question. Thanks for asking it. So one of the things in the Act, under I think Section 33, I can't remember off the top of my head, I'm required by the Act to maintain an advisory group. And on the advisory group are Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Children's Commissioner, the 2 that you reference. Others, UK Information Commissioner sits on my advisory group, a number of academics, Leverhulme Institute of Forensic Science, etc., etc. So through the professional advisory group, we engage with the Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Children's Commissioner on a regular basis and on specific pieces of work. So in our legislation, one of the requirements on the Commissioner is that the Commissioner must, it's not discretionary, must have regards to the interests of children and vulnerable people. And that is why when we, the very first 2 assurance reviews that we did, we intentionally chose to look at children and vulnerable people for those reasons, a legislative imperative. we actually did want to work with the Children's Commissioner on the Children's one, and at the time Bruce, who was the Commissioner, had indicated they will, but they couldn't resource it, so we defaulted to the Children and Young Persons Centre for Youth Justice. Likewise, on the vulnerable adults piece, we tied in with COSLA through the Vulnerable Adult Network in Scotland, and brought other practitioners, subject experts into the field. So we do work very heavily in partnerships with others, because it's more effective and efficient to do so, and it allows a tiny organisation like mine to punch above its weight by working collaboratively with others.
Thanks, that's very useful. Thanks. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much. Ash Regan.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to move on now to accountability and scrutiny mechanisms. You'll know that the committee, we're very interested to know if the scrutiny that you are receiving is robust, if you feel that it's appropriate. So could you give us your view on how you're scrutinised, and if you think there's more effective ways that that could be done?
Yeah. So I think I've indicated in my written submission that I don't receive as much scrutiny as I'd like to, or not as often as I'd like to. It's probably a better way to phrase it. So I'll have been in post for 4 years in April, and by April I will have laid 11 reports in Parliament, 3 annual reports and an operational report, 5 assurance reviews, because there's one coming next week and one coming 3 weeks after that, a strategic plan, code of practice. I've only appeared before the Criminal Justice Committee twice. That's not a criticism of the Criminal Justice Committee, because they're a whole economy committee and they've got massive issues on their plate. But I would expect, as an office holder, to be called before the relevant committee at least once a year. And I think that the right time to do that would be between November and, say, March, after the annual report has been laid, because obviously if Audit Scotland pick up on any issues, then that's the opportunity for the relevant committee to hold us to account. So that's on the parliamentary bit, and of course we're always happy to appear before committees like this or the Finance Committee. In relation to the Parliament Corporation, we appear before them in person once a year. Ross and I have just been this morning. And as with the Criminal Justice Committee, the actual scrutiny itself is very robust, it's very intrusive, but supportive at the same time. But again, with the Parliament Corporation, I would like to appear before them twice a year, because roughly about the first week in August every year, we are asked to submit our budget submission for the following year. Our budget is always just based on our static staffing model, plus normally whatever the inflation figure is we're asked to use, with the exception that obviously we got Ross in temporarily for a couple of years. But I think it would be better practice for the Parliament Corporation to look office holders in the eye, particularly where they're making any growth bids around staffing, etc., and to absolutely satisfy themselves that those are absolutely required.
Okay, so just to summarise, you think increased frequency, both by the corporate body and possibly by committees, although obviously we all understand there are capacities issues with the Justice Committee, which is why I think in the last session they had the subcommittee, didn't they, on policing, which gave extra capacity. But can I just pick up on that point, the number of reports that you mentioned there? You feel that there's a number of those that really you're not getting any sort of scrutiny on, those reports that you've produced?
I think what I'm probably trying to say in a very clumsy way is that providing the office holders are called before the relevant committee once a year, and that happens, then that's an opportunity to cover both the annual report and any other relevant reports that have been laid in Parliament over that period. So I wouldn't expect, for example, the Criminal Justice Committee just would not have time to to see us every time we publish a report. And I wouldn't expect that, but once a year would be good if it's achievable, and it would allow all the business to be swept up in one session.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And just in that space, the 6 key recommendations that you gave were interesting and helpful in the written submission. The last one, 6, you say Scottish ministers and Parliament should review the functions of all SPCB supported bodies every 5 years. Yeah. I just wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about that. It's just an interesting suggestion.
It's just a personal view, and it goes back to the point that I made earlier on that, and I saw this in policing over about 4 decades. Is, you know, you continually invest in new things and take on new duties and responsibilities, but organisations are very bad at stopping to do things, and they, in the case of the Parliament office holders, it may well be that the particular set of circumstances that gave rise to their creation in 2002, whilst absolutely appropriate, maybe in 2032 or 2042 will no longer be relevant because the world will have changed. So I think. Just as a general principle, because you decide to invest in something, doesn't mean that you should stay with that model forever. So it's just a general principle.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful, and appreciate the candid way in which you've put it forward. And I reflect also on the evidence you gave to the Criminal Justice Committee, which I also sit on, and what you were talking about in response to Lorna Slater in terms of how. The different ways in which biometrics are utilised, where and how they may be utilised in the future, both here in Scotland and internationally. I mean, when I think back to what you said at the Criminal Justice Committee, you did give an indication that there might not be a necessity for your position in the future. And I don't know if you want to just, for the record, say that again or a bit more about it for the benefit of our committee.
I'm very happy to do that. I mean, I think some of the biometric technologies that we have been around for a long time. They weren't even called biometric technologies, So the police have been taking people's fingerprints in Scotland for over 120 years. They've been taking people's photographs for more than 120 years. DNA has been around since the late 1980s, and you can read all about that next Wednesday. There is a move now in policing. So at the moment we have a UK fingerprint database, and we share fingerprints with the EU and Interpol under certain conditions. And we have a UK DNA database, and we share DNA with the 27 member states and Interpol under certain circumstances. The European Union last year, year before, agreed something called Prüm 2, which is an extension of that framework. And so the European Union are going to start sharing people's facial images. And in due course, the UK will be invited to join that. There's a move by the Home Office and National Police Chiefs Council at the moment to create a single UK custody image database in the same way as exists for DNA and fingerprints. And to that new system will be applied artificial intelligence that will facilitate both retrospective facial matching and support live facial recognition for those police forces which choose to go down that route. So we're kind of on the edge of the next kind of digital revolution in biometrics and policing, where advanced AI-powered technologies are going to facilitate some of these issues around face. So there's going to be we're going to come to a kind of watershed moment in Scotland, probably in the next few years, where we're going to have to make a decision on what's right for Scotland in terms of this. Do we as a country support the use of live facial recognition by the police, or don't we, for example? But when we get beyond that, I could reasonably foresee a point in the future where the contentious nature of some of this comes off the political agenda. And so that was my broader point, which is we might in the future get into a more settled landscape where the Parliament is content that there isn't a need for independent oversight of this, or alternatively that it could sit with another organisation that already exists, you know. So does that answer your question?
It does, and it's helpful in the context of also your 6 key recommendation,
yes,
and that 6th one in particular. So thank you very much for elaborating on that. Before we can conclude, I just wondered if there's anything that you wanted to say today or emphasise that you haven't had the chance to.
Well, I should have said at the start, if you've got any hard questions, ask. But no, I mean, I think, convener, the thing that I would just, the sort of parting thought that I would want to leave you with is, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree that the existing landscape isn't fit for purpose, but I do agree that there's room for significant improvement in the coordination of shared services and collaborative working. So I suppose that's my parting thought to the committee.
And that's very helpful, as has been all of your evidence today and your written submission. So thank you very much to both of you for attending and for your contributions and for your time. The committee next week will hear from the Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Children and Young People's